Hello, I'm Steve Sokol, the president of the American Council on Germany, and I'd like to welcome you to today's Kaffeepause. Each week, we check in with a Berlin-based journalist to talk about emerging stories and the news that's shaping the headlines in Germany and across Europe. And today, I am delighted to welcome back Andreas Kluth. He's a columnist with Bloomberg and previously served as editor-in-chief of Handelsblatt Global, and he was a writer for The Economist before that. Andreas, welcome back. It's always great to see you.
Hi, Steve. Great to be back.
So, Andreas, you are coming off of a long weekend. Yesterday was October 3rd, German Unity Day, and so I thought we could maybe start our conversation by talking a little bit about how united Germany is 32 years after unification.
Well, all the viewers will have their own, point of view on that. It's a matter of how you look at it. I talked to some people and saw some interviews with people in Thuringia, for example, where the objective way to answer would be, we've come so far, and it should be clear to any reasonable East German and West Germans as well that their lives are better today than they would be if there hadn't been reunification. And so much has been achieved. And yet, you probably empathize with this feeling. It feels like there's been no reunification sometimes to me. Mm-hmm. So for instance, if you look at certain maps, and then if you shaded certain areas, I'll give you some examples, you would see the old East Germany and the old West Germany as if the wall were still there. So I'm thinking of, like, for example, the voting share of the Alternative for Germany plus the left, plus Die Linke. Okay. In Thuringia, they have a majority of seats, which they can't use because they won't form a coalition, obviously. But so, and that is and the flip side for quote unquote West German parties like the Greens, the Free Democrats. Okay, if you just plotted that on a map, you see West Germany, the old federal states, you see, and the new ones. If you do opinion polls, like this one is quite painful to me to behold, but that there were again last night protests, especially in East Germany, organized, called for by both sympathizes with the AfD and the left. So these two, essentially, they've become regional parties, but people protesting, of course, against inflation, but always with this subtext of, some anti-Americanism, some pro-Russian, Russophilia, calling for Nord Stream 2, just been blown up, and, to go into operation, which is impossible. It doesn't even make sense. So they still, to this day, and maybe increasingly, view East Germans, West Germans view the world in totally different ways. And I think in some ways that is a tragedy.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I think we had a discussion on Friday before the weekend with two journalists who both came from Saxony originally. And they were talking about the fact that obviously the quality of life is better in the East, and that we have to recognize the historical significance of German unification, but that certain divisions sort of carry on in the minds of people, and it's going to take a while for those divisions to be reduced. And I think particularly in the political spectrum, as you're describing, that's very important. And so I'd like to maybe touch on a piece that you just wrote on the 1st of October. You had a piece in Bloomberg on some of the fundamental challenges to democracy, and you honed in a little bit on the polarization across the political spectrum, that there's been a decline in civility, there's been a hardening of political lines. Can you talk about sort of the overarching threat to democracy that you see from the 30,000-foot level, but then also how you see it playing out in Germany specifically?
Well, from a German point of view, first of all, I'd say, fortunately, Germany trails the trend, maybe because of its dual dictatorship experience, historical experience. It's late to it, but it's happening. So what I did in that column, it was a column on thuggishness. Literally, the word thugs, which comes from Hindi, by the way. I don't know via Sanskrit, or Sanskrit via Hindi, but basically, you know, we see in Brazil right now, we see in Hungary, in the US, very much worldwide, we see this, the slump of democracy and related values, and different, you know, pundits have different ways of explaining it, and you come with dichotomies, and left, right is one, and, you know, anywheres versus somewheres, you know, nativists versus your blue versus red, all of those. And I'm just saying the more fundamental, the underlying one is civility versus thuggishness. And really, that's what you see with, and it sometimes smells or looks a bit like the 1920s in Italy or Germany to me. You know, it's just the rise of thuggishness, the sometimes physical violence, January 6th, you know, for example, but the verbal violence, the lack of civility, the breakdown of that, and which includes some rhetorical you know, conventions that have snuck in on Twitter, but on Fox News and everywhere. And I don't want to make it right or left because I see it everywhere. It just, like, things, for instance, there's whataboutism. It's just the fact that we're losing the ability, or may have lost it, to have a civilized conversation about anything, because essentially it becomes a shouting match, or it's like, oh yeah, well, what about this? And sort of the changing of the subject, and then leading up to total cynical disregard of truth. All of this is very banal and obvious. And Steve, I feel it's too obvious to say in some ways, but that has somehow, I don't remember that 20 years ago being like that. Mm-hmm. And so once we succumb to this thuggishness, because one thing that happened in the 20s in Italy and Germany, and has happened in Russia, is that when the thugs take over, the rest of us, even if we're in the majority, we retreat. As we've retreated from Twitter, we retreat from the public square, because we're scared of the thugs. Okay, we show up for a conversation, they show up for a fight, basicay, and whether it's verbal or just physical, the violence doesn't matter. And I think that is, I don't know how far down that process we are, but that is really worrying. And so this is very simple. I mean, there's not much more to it than that. And in Germany, you see it too, okay? And you see it in the rhetoric, AfD on the left. Again, I'm almost, not quite, but I'm almost symmetrical about it here. It's behind the trend because I think Germans are so scared of thuggishness. It's interesting that in Italy, they're not as scared of it. I don't think Giorgia Meloni is. It doesn't, you know, like she once admired Mussolini, maybe still does, but I don't think she is a Mussolini. She's not comparable, I think, to even Orban, and certainly not to Putin or anything like that. But it's interesting that they've lost that herd immunity almost. So in more and more places, you see this deterioration of this culture of debating, of conversing, of listening to each other, of being civil. And I think that's what's going to do us in.
Well, and so, Andreas, I'm happy that you brought up Italy, because I was going to ask you how much you think the election results in Sweden and Italy sort of contribute to where we are, because it seems as if sort of there's this tilting or listing to the right, and not just to the right, but to more populist right-wing parties in countries that we had thought were pretty stable.
Yeah, 2 don't make a trend yet. Of course, we've got other examples. 3 would make a trend, I think, for journalists. I think there's some. But Sweden and Italy, I think, are, so in Sweden, the Sweden Democrats, which have roots in a neo-Nazi party. In Italy, 3 parties, right, center-right, with some roots in a neo-fascist party. I think there's symptoms rather than cause of a trend. And I wouldn't, you know, I think the immediate consequence of those 2 elections may be pretty meek, actually. They both are there, have so many checks and balances, as the US does still, but the US is fighting to preserve its checks and balances right now. I think Sweden and Italy still have them. And I would expect that once Giorgia Meloni shows up in Brussels, she's already toned down some of her sort of outspoken, her campaign rhetoric. There's only so much she can do. But Orban in Hungary has been different. He always takes it to the edge. He really holds Europe hostage again and again. There's another sanctions, the 8th, I think, package against Russia in the works right now by the EU. He may hold that up again. Okay, so I don't think Sweden or Italy will break Europe, but that's sort of the way it's gone recently, and it's not helpful. So at the same time, I just don't consider Giorgia Meloni in the same league. I think it's just too chaotic. It's too, it's too Italian. They're not. I think Orban is more worrisome. I'm hopeful because it used to be Poland and Hungary ganging up against the EU using its mechanisms, and now they've come apart. Not completely yet on things like rule of law, but because Poland is willing to say Putin is the enemy and we have to stand together against him, and Orban still is not, and that's horrified the Poles. So we'll see where it goes, but this all points to the design flaws in the European Union, which raises than other, which is why Emmanuel Macron in France came up with this idea where the first meeting is on Thursday in Prague of the European political community. Could you possibly start some new structure that doesn't have the design flaws of the EU and takes in more European countries? But basically, I'm not so worried about Meloni, but I'm worried about almost everything else, starting with Putin, of course.
So I'd like to get to your assessment of the European political community in just a moment. But as we were talking about before we went live, I was in Pittsburgh yesterday because the minister president of Baden-Württemberg, Winfried Kretschmann, has a large trade delegation in Pittsburgh and then in LA, looking at artificial intelligence in the fields of medical health or medicine, and automotive and autonomous driving. And they're looking to build sort of scientific research and economic partnerships across the Atlantic. But on the periphery of this trade visit, we hosted an event that focused on resilient societies. And he identified some of the challenges that you're talking about in terms of waning trust in democratic institutions and practices, and sort of concern about some of the internal, some of the domestic, but also some of the foreign challenges to democracies. And he said, we really need to make sure that there's participation, that all voices are heard. He went on to say that we need to have active communities and that we need to create sort of fora for the exchange of ideas, and that it be a fact-based exchange of ideas. As you've kind of reflected on rising thuggishness in some of our democracies, and a reduction in civility, which is necessary to have these kinds of conversations and exchanges, do you have any thoughts on what can be done to bring back civility and reduce sort of this thuggish trend or tendency that you're seeing?
Well, first of all, I think, I don't know if you know, but I have a lot of time for Winfried Kretschmann. I've interviewed him, it's a while ago now, but he's got his ear to the ground. I think he's a nimble thinker. He's gone against his own party often, the Greens, and I really have a lot of time for him. And of course, he's spot on. And by the way, Baden-Württemberg is interesting because on one hand, this is one of the richest states with Mittelstand firms, with the car industry. That's why he's interested in autonomous driving. He wants to combine ecology and economy, getting rich, but keep saving the world, which not all Greens have registered. All of that. And at the same time, in Baden-Württemberg, there's this always has been this pocket of conspiracy theorists as well. So I think Querdenker originates there, and some of these anti-vax movements long before COVID. So he's probably very alive to that. So and yet what you just reported, he said what we must do is the typical thing that a politician and some journalists feel, well, okay, I've just given the diagnosis and the analysis. Now I have to say something constructive and we have to get together and it has to be fact-based. That's exactly the problem. We can get together, but it's sort of, we show up to talk, they show up, or we show up with a knife, they show up with a gun or whatever it is. They're not there. So I fear, and this is a little bit my recent experience of attempts to have those conversations, attempts that have failed, because it takes two sides in a conversation, or many sides, all sides, converse meant to turn towards each other. If one side doesn't want to, or if the other side shows up with conspiracy theories and has bid farewell, they will never admit that they have two truth, or they're so cynical they say, well, there's just many infinite number of truths, it doesn't matter anymore. That's the software, that's the operating system. Once that's broken, this system won't run anymore. So for him to call for us to get together and for it to be fact-based is cute. I'm for it. We're all for it. Nobody would be against it.
Yeah.
I don't see it happening. That's all I can say. I have no solution. It just
it's one of those situations.
All the journalist sometimes does is, hey, this is going in a bad way,
Right. I mean, it's one of those situations where it's good to say it, but the devil is in the details in terms of how one actually implements it and gets to that point. Shifting gears, I want to come back to Europe, right? Because you brought up Europe, you brought up some of the current design flaws, and at the moment, it seems as if German Finance Minister Christian Lindner is really in the hot seat. He's facing tough questions from his fellow EU finance ministers about how to address gas prices. Berlin has been blocking an EU gas price cap at the EU level. But in Germany, of course, it's introducing a 200 billion euro relief plan to help subsidize gas for industry and consumers. And one of our viewers is curious if you know how much, if at all, Scholz, Lindner, Habeck discussed the 200 billion package with the EU or with French counterparts, and whether they considered the European implications of this disparity that would come about.
This is a very interesting question, because to me it goes into the so-called German question, which I recently wrote a column on. I'm going to get to Lindner in that in a second, which the column is a few weeks old. It's about Poland asking for war reparations and the issues behind Poland and Germany, behind that relationship. And I think they made that official today, that demand for reparations. So it officially was signed and is coming in the diplomatic pouch today. But the German question in Brussels, in this case, what he said is I have to make explicit what I see in common is Germany, it's been often said, is, too large to follow and too small to lead. Okay. So, or it's Kissinger said too small for the world, too large for Europe. There's all these different versions, but because of its size, the economic size, the demographic size, whenever Germany does anything, it's almost like the European Union had already done a policy, except that it hasn't. Germany's just, with its own very provincial, sort of controversies and stuff, done something and forgets, or omits to tell anybody else. And by the way, so again, to the Poles and to the rest of Europe and the gas crisis, that's exactly what happened for 20 years. 2 decades with Nord Stream 1 and then Nord Stream 2, these two gas pipelines. And all the mentalities around it, which from the point of view of everyone in the Eastern EU, and a lot of people in the Western EU as well now, and the Americans as well, which was one way the Germans walked voluntarily into this dependence and created this problem of gas dependency in the first place. If the shoes were reversed, the Germans in the Euro crisis, the Germans are always great at lecturing the Greeks and others about, austerity or something, things they did wrong when there's a crisis. This crisis is to a large extent from the point of view of others caused by previous German policy failures.
Right.
And the Germans, what do? First of all, that's not acknowledged in that way in Germany. But the Germans respond, and of course they respond. It's a bit like the U.S. when they make policies on the U.S. dollar, and which is the U.S. currency and the world's problem, in the famous quote. But the Germans here, they want to help their own population. That's completely normal, and have this bazooka, this fiscal bazooka, to make it easier for various German constituencies, and forget to inform or coordinate it with the European Union. You asked me how much did they discuss it. I'm not aware that they discussed it at all. They may have discussed it. Oh, I wonder how that'll go down in Brussels. But it doesn't matter whether they were aware of it. I mean, there's always Germans in Brussels, Germans in Washington, Germans in Warsaw who will, telegraph back, hey, careful if you do, but they just ignored it completely. So Lindner, once again, shows up in Brussels and just got an earful by the other finance ministers, especially the French partners. They're supposed to be the tandem, but saying, hey, look, we're all in this mess. And by the way, this particular mess of all the messes was largely caused by the Germans. But now you're doing these things. You didn't coordinate that. We're not sure where it leaves our fiscal policy or any joint efforts, They were still, a lot of them were hoping to have a Corona bonds 2.0, sort of another common EU level fiscal answer. Lindner and the Free Democrats aren't interested in that at all. Okay. So, but you have that German question again. The Germans are just doing things in their own interest, whether it's pipelines in the past 2 decades, whether it's this fiscal package now, or gas, crisis policies, and just neglect to inform or coordinate with the others, and causing large problems for the smaller countries and causing a lot of animosity. And the amazing thing to me is that a lot of them aren't aware of it. The Germans aren't, politicians are very often not aware of it, which is a symptom of a large country. And I think that if someone like Meloni did things like that, then people would call it nationalism and things like that. But Germany just does it out of naivete or tone deafness very often.
My guess is that it's more tone deafness than naivete. Just a hunch, because it seems, in this case, as if Germany's actions might exacerbate gas prices in other parts of the EU, might drive a wedge between richer and poorer member states within the EU, and yet Germany's own national interests are at the forefront of this, right? Keep gas prices low so that the private sector, so that companies, that consumers have cheap gas, and that the economy is not disrupted as much as it might otherwise be. And this reminds me at least a little bit of the financial crisis and sort of Germany's push for austerity in some of those poorer countries. I'm thinking specifically about Greece and the Greek response to Germany's position during the financial crisis. Is this part of a bigger problem that Germany has within Europe? I think that's sort of the fundamental question here.
Well, I think it is that German question, which which stays forever unresolved, and it's a flaw in another. It's an imbalance. I think that you said tone deafness. I agree with you. I don't think the Germans are doing it intentionally. I think it's just the mechanisms of the EU assume a sort of parity or equality among the 27 on paper. The reality is that the weight of one member is so large compared to the others that it, it's like if you're on a seesaw and suddenly this elephant shows up and everyone, it gets thrown off the other end of the seesaw. And that is, again, I have no solution really to it. But it just reminds me of Thomas Mann in a famous speech just after World War II, just, was afraid of of a German Europe and was hoping for a European Germany. And that was a great way of framing it. And I think we're still far from a European Germany. It's just something that they all mainstream politicians, not on the extremes, but all mainstream profess that in their stump speeches, in their interviews. Then they turn around and do something and are completely oblivious that the next 5 things they do completely blow that out of the water. You know.
So let's come back to if we're talking about Europe, let's come back to Macron's European political community. I guess one question that I have is whether Europe needs yet another sort of institution or framework to work within. Although it was interesting yesterday, I guess, to see that Liz Truss, the new Prime Minister of the UK, has said yes to the European political community just after Brexit. So maybe this is a way of bringing the UK back into the European family, if you will. The question for me is sort of what's the point of the European political community?
I just wrote a column, which will be out probably tomorrow or on Thursday. The meeting in Prague in the castle where the 30 Years' War started is on Thursday, and 44 countries are going. So it's really easy to make fun of it. So therefore, I do make fun of it a bit. And at the end, I say, but let's not make fun of it, because nowadays, as Putin threatens nuclear war and stuff, as we have war in Europe, it's still better when we gather and talk than when we stop doing that, right? And so the fear is that, so what Macron, it was his idea, noticed is that the current institutions, of which Europe has many, and I go through some of them, the Council of Europe, which is always confused with the European Council, and they have nothing, just a number of things with Council and Europe. And Council of the European Union is not the European Council, which has nothing to do with the Council of Europe. So there's all these things, and then there's the OSCE, and there's various other frameworks, and they're clearly all inadequate in some ways. And the EU is extremely dysfunctional. We've just touched on various aspects of it. And I think Macron had several specific things in mind when he proposed this new thing. And I'm willing to give it time to see how it evolves. But one specific thing is one of the many design flaws of the EU is that it excludes many nations. Turkey became officially a candidate in 1999, has no chance of joining. At some point, they realized that long ago, and they've been sulking, and they will always sulk. And I think that could happen to us in Serbia and Bosnia and North Macedonia and Albania. It could have happened to us in Moldova, Ukraine, Georgia, and all these other countries. So there's the problem of the wider or deeper of the enlargement process. Right. And at the same time, you have the UK leaving, the Swiss and the Norwegians and some just opting out. And then they're out of the decision-making process when we can no longer afford that, when we have someone like Putin or Lukashenko, nominally Europeans, but threats to Europe at our doorstep. So Macron reasonably came up, well, maybe we need something new where everyone, the UK and Georgia and Moldova, and where we're all there. And so that makes sense. If it just becomes another democracy, it's bad, But if it becomes something functional, because let's say they've learned from the mistakes of the EU, let's say where you don't give each member veto power and where you can eject a member or a member can leave voluntarily. And a couple of these things, we have a long list of problems with the EU that they wouldn't do again if they could. And it becomes effective, and it eventually becomes some sort of defense union. And I mean, in 20 years,
Yeah.
Then who knows? Maybe we want to keep that and get rid of the EU or something like that. So I'm just keeping an open mind, although it is so tempting to make fun of it now because it's yet another, they're meeting in the castle and all the flags, and then they have,
But I guess if one's trying to be optimistic about it, the fundamental question of bringing in additional partners is whether the European political community can serve as a vehicle to help shore up Europe's security order in the face of the war in Ukraine, right? I mean, at the end of the day, Putin's attack on Ukraine has to be one of the major catalysts for Macron really trying to move forward with this proposal right now.
If we view the West's response against Putin, which is in flux, we don't know how it'll end, as an all-society response, not just military, then the EU has an important part, and right now you see that in energy and in gas, right? But in the immediate term, I think the European political community is almost looking forward to future conflicts, because in this one we've, I think, all grasped that the only institution that matters is NATO, and the only country that matters is the US. Do any thought experiment and take the US out, and there's almost nothing left except rhetoric, right? And I think it surprised Putin this year that the EU and NATO and the combination have stood together as much as they have, and that there aren't more Viktor Orbáns, So, but one of the problems is that the EU, in terms of the hard power, it was always notorious for that, for not even understanding hard power and putting all its bets on soft power. It used to have a lot of soft power, and it has almost no hard power. And I would like it to have hard power and to synchronize its hard power. I've written that too about, the European army, just more of a, if it went that way someday, maybe in response to this war, I think that would be good. And it used to be that the US was against the European army, Madeleine Albright and stuff, thinking it would duplicate and make redundant or complicate or compromise NATO. But in fact, that could be a European and a North American pillar of a joint alliance, could eventually make us stronger. But we're far, far away from that.
Yeah, Andreas, you just talked about the sort of surprise to Putin of Western unity, European unity in the face of his aggression. Of course, earlier in our conversation, we were talking about gas and the energy issues. As it gets colder, as energy prices go up, how long do you think this sense of unity will hold? Both, on a domestic level in Germany, because we're definitely seeing public opinion polls where 70% of the population, more than 70% of the population, supports strong action against Ukraine, but also in Europe, in the wider Europe. How long do you think this unity will hold in face of day-to-day concerns and hardships?
You may notice I'm wearing a very warm-looking sweater.
I saw that.
I got it out of the basement today because it got cold here this week, and I in line with the new spirit, I've not turned on any heat or anything, and I'm telling the kids and everyone, no, we're going to take cold, short showers. So I'm dressing warmly already now in October, and so I'm ready to shiver a bit for our Ukrainian friends who are, risking their lives. Jesus, is that hard?
Yeah.
I don't know. Is that an actual question? But the funny thing is, it is not the funny thing. The sad thing it is, because I mentioned the marches last night in East Germany. There were similar ones in Slovakia and Prague a few weeks ago. I called that weird. Yeah, that Putin has his partisans. He was hoping at the beginning of the year more from them through his disinformation, his lies, but people are telling his narratives to some extent. They are not winning yet, those narratives, but they're there and they won't go away. And will unity hold together, you asked? I don't know if it will. I hope it does, obviously. If it's just energy, I think we'll get through it. But that war is now so fast moving, so kinetic suddenly. I mean, the annexation of those 4 regions was so outrageous, and the nuclear threats and the implicit connection and the war gaming. And that was sort of my own favorite column of the past couple of weeks, where I went through scenarios, a decision tree, it's called, for Biden, for the West. What do we do if that, that we're thinking through that. But these are such momentous possibilities beyond putting on a warm sweater that I don't know if we'll hold together. But my guess is Putin seems to be escalating himself into corners, and that's a mixed metaphor. And I wonder. I mean, I think he lost touch with reality long ago. But I wonder if he's still making the decisions. I mean, he's afraid of maybe a further right coup at home now. He's clearly starting to get nervous for his political life, maybe even his other life, and doing very bizarre things that could end very badly. And so I don't know what will happen to our unity when it comes to those even more existential questions. If there were a nuclear disaster at the power plant, Zaporizhia, or an actual detonation of a so-called small, low-yield tactical, and the radioactivity wafts into NATO, if he actually attacks something that sends, let's say, tanks in the future to Ukraine, a depot that's in a NATO, like in Poland, what would happen? How would we respond? And the problem is that you see these counter narratives, these Putin narratives, propaganda narratives, they're here and they're not winning. And I just hope they keep losing. But that is something to watch. Don't know how it'll turn out.
So Andreas, earlier in our conversation, you touched briefly on the relationship between Germany and Poland, and you brought up the issue of reparations. German Foreign Minister Annalena Baerbock was just in Poland, and I think the main focus of her visit was to show solidarity, to show unity on Ukraine. And of course, the issue of reparations from World War II came up again as well. And at a joint press conference with her Polish counterpart, Minister Rau, she was clear that this issue is closed as far as Berlin is concerned, and there will be no reparations. Do you think that's the end of the story, or is this something to continue watching?
This story never ends. The Greeks also keep asking every few years for reparations. And I talked to someone in Greece once, and they just had a witty way of putting it. The official German line was always before reunification during the Cold War. Before reunification, the Germans said it was too early to discuss reparations. After reunification, they said it was too late. So it's either too early or too late. So it was not. Of course, the Germans have done a number of, both West Germany and East Germany separately, a number of sort of, I would say, nominal, payments to Israel, to the former Yugoslavia at that time, to various, and then East Germany paid its communist big brother in the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union was supposed to remit some of that to Poland, which was destroyed mainly by Germans, but also by Soviets. It was also nominally the Germans have, in the legalistic way, saying these things are settled. We don't want to talk about it, but they keep coming up. However, they come up right now in a very, it is very immature, the context in which the Poles are bringing it up, because at a time when we should show unity and we have a common enemy and we are friends nowadays, the Poles, the Peace Party, the Law and Justice Party, it has signaled, that they're running for an election next year. And in every campaign, they've chosen sort of a main bogeyman. It used migrants, Muslims, like Orban, sort of gays, Brussels, etc. And they've clearly this time chosen Germany. So there's just in every, that they're coming out with this anti-German rhetoric because it plays in their demographic that they're targeting, and that's kind of irresponsible. Okay, so this is unnecessary, and it puts Baerbock in a very difficult situation. Privately, she probably understands that it's kind of reasonable, but as she's foreign minister there now, what is she going to say? She can't open that up. She hopes for them and everyone else in Europe to start working on the common problems, number one of which is Putin. So this is a distraction. So that's why the polls are being immature. I'm not saying completely unreasonable, but if you're that over the top on these things, then there's nothing the Germans can say or do. They asked for 1.3 trillion, I believe. They asked for between 2 and 3 annual federal German budgets worth. That's not going to happen right now. Okay. So if you're going to come up with that, come up with something better, because there's a lot of people who do want to listen, who do want to make it right. That said, Baerbock and all the ministers, we mentioned Habeck, Lindner, they're in an impossible situation and doing pretty well, those ministers.
So we've talked about the difficult situation that Lindner and Baerbock are in. We haven't really talked about the difficult situation that Robert Habeck is in, and I'd like to maybe spend a couple minutes talking about him, because of course, as Minister of the Economy and Energy, he's on the front lines of many of the issues that we've talked about. And as a matter of fact, earlier this year, he was, it's fair to say, the most popular politician in Germany. He was communicating well. The public seemed to like him a lot. And yet, as the energy crisis sort of continues, his popularity is waning. So how do you think Habeck is navigating the current situation?
He's vice chancellor, and he took that double ministry of energy and the economy, which was the Ludwig Erhard's old ministry, very important. And I thought he was like, oh, it could have been better. I wanted to be candidate first of all next year. Then I wanted he wanted the finance ministry. So he thought it might be too small for him, and it's now becoming the largest. I mean, by just the way history worked, he's at the intersection of every problem there is this year. Well, short of defense, the defense minister is also, but he came in with this very refreshing and initially, as you said, popular communication style that Germans are not used to, which is he takes the audience, the question, the journalist seriously and actually answers, sometimes says when he doesn't know the answer, or you can see him thinking on his feet like an intellectual. He is an intellectual. He's the opposite of Scholz in terms of communication, if you ask me. Scholz is cagey and doesn't, I think it's Scholz who is disappointing. I, therefore, didn't find Habeck personally disappointing, because I saw him thinking through an extremely fast-moving and complicated, difficult problem. What exactly was he supposed to do? Now, he's also stuck, I believe, I have not confirmed, I cannot confirm this, that he privately would have already agreed to extend the 3 remaining nuclear power plants in the situation long ago. But he's in a party where Jürgen Trittin and where he has to be in that party, like every politician. And the Greens were founded on being the anti-nuclear party. And he realized he couldn't go that step. And that's put him between a rock and a hard place, in an impossible situation. And he is in a 3-way coalition where the Free Democrats are difficult, the Greens are difficult, and the Social Democrats or I think Scholz could be doing much more. And I think what you're seeing in the polls is simply people not paying so much attention to the detail, but seeing that all the areas where they're hurting, or some of them, not inflation, but like gas prices, energy prices, all of that, heating bills, seem to somehow, it's that guy Habeck at the press conference when that comes up. So he must be not dealing with that, which is I don't know what a better answer so far as of October 2022 he could have come up with. I don't know what it would have been. So if we get through this, I think he will rise again in the polls. That's how these things go, or maybe not. But we first have to see how we get through it. If we get through it without brownouts, blackouts, without too much shivering, but that again, actually it depends. Actually, the only person to blame for all of this is Putin. and certainly
Right.
not Habeck or people like that. But right now, people are blaming Habeck, and they should be blaming Schultz more, if anything. And I think at some point, if we get through this, they will stop blaming Habeck again, and then Habeck will be, with his communication style, able to explain how we got through.
Yeah. I mean, we'll have to see how bad this winter is, and based on some reports that I've been seeing, and even some things that Habeck has said, we have to think about what next winter is going to be like, and making sure that the infrastructure is there so that next winter is not as bad as this winter, no matter what the weather is like.
Yeah.
Andreas, as we start to come to a close here, I'd like to bring up another topic that we haven't talked about yet, because I was a little surprised over the weekend to read a report that as of September of this year, more refugees arrived in Germany than in all of 2015.
That's amazing.
1 million from Ukraine alone, hundreds of thousands of people coming from Russia, Tunisia, Lebanon, and Africa. And yet, in the press, I'm not reading very much about migration and about these numbers. And I wanted to know from you, sort of, how big of an issue do you think migration is at the moment?
It's not, and that's simply the economy of issues. That is, if you have an even bigger issue, like when we were
war and the energy crisis,
we're no longer, we didn't discuss Corona at all. It's not gone. The Oktoberfest led to a quadrupling of the incidents in Munich, and a lot of older people are still at risk. So it's not gone. It's just we don't perceive it as so frightening anymore, so we stop talking about it. Okay, if Putin were a puppy dog this year, then there wouldn't be so many refugees for a start, but then we probably would think this is another big problem. The problem is just when there's someone there who's actually, threatening nuclear war, everything else seems small. That's one problem. Then I have a slightly darker assessment too. You mentioned the Ukrainian refugees. They're in a different legal position than the Syrians were. They don't have to apply for asylum. We just took them, we're just in. They come, they don't need visas, they don't need any of that. The many others you mentioned do need that. But therefore we may see a resurgence in that topic. Okay. But for the Ukrainians, it's also true that they're Christian, white, and mainly female, and young children. And in Poland, for example, Poland was, with Hungary, one of the two countries, the main countries against any common European solution in the 2015-16 crisis. They're taking in the most Ukrainians because they're looking very similar and non-threatening to them, and that is part of it too. The Ukrainians here, they stand out less, and I think people react to them less negatively, react to them very positively. And on top of that, they all understand why they're here. It's the same. I think they're viewed as fellow Europeans by most, and victims of the same problem we're all afraid of. So it's easier to take them in. They're also going back a lot. So coming and going, it's different than the Syrians who only went one way. So it's a very different crisis. The frontline countries are different, right? Not Greece and then the Balkans and then Austria and that chain, but Poland, Slovakia. But I do expect it to become a bigger issue. And for me, it never went away. And it's always a reminder, and the Ukrainians are in that especially, but it's always a reminder. We never reformed the migration, the Dublin system of the EU since the last crisis. So especially if the countries of origin change again, and there's more Middle Easterners, you will see it come up again. And at some point, you got to wonder with the European Union always, at which point is it just one crisis too many? We mentioned Maloney, we mentioned the Sweden Democrats, we mentioned the European political economy and Putin, all of that gas. At some point, the thing could crack,
At which point we're back at the sort of fundamental design flaws of the EU that we spent some of our time talking about today. And undoubtedly, that's a topic that we could spend a lot more on, and maybe we should come back to at some point in the future. Andreas, I want to thank you for taking the time to talk with us today. It is always wonderful to speak with you. So insightful, so thoughtful, and so wide-ranging. I've really
Thank you.
enjoyed this
Thank you, Steve.
conversation, and I hope that our viewers have as well. But ein herzlichen Dank nach Berlin. Thank you so much, and I look forward to seeing you again soon. Stay
Yep.
warm, and stay healthy.
Yeah.